The question of how Europe, after suffering the catastrophic shock of the 14th century plague, was able to move forward sustained economic transformation while the Indian subcontinent, despite its civilizational depth and enormous wealth, didn't experience a comparable rise in per capita income before the 19th century cannot be answered through a single event, invention, or moral explanation. It requires understanding how pre-industrial economics functioned, how shocks altered incentive structures, and how long-term institutional and ecological conditions shaped outcomes. What occurred between roughly 1350 and 1800s was not a miracle recovery, nor a sudden European awakening, but a slow reconfiguration of economic constraints in part of Europe that eventually made industrialization possible. The difference was structural, not genetic, not civilizational, and not reducible to steel, plague, or colonial greed alone. The Black Death of the mid-14th century was one of the most violent demographic shocks in human history. Large parts of Europe lost between a third and a half of their population in a matter of years. In purely economic terms, this didn't make Europe richer in any absolute sense. Output collapsed, cities emptied, trade networks shrank, fiscal systems weakened. What the plague did change was the ratio between people and resources. Land became abundant relative to labor. This altered bargaining power. In large parts of Western Europe, especially England and the Low Countries, surviving workers could demand higher real wages, migrate more freely, and resist traditional forms of feudal coercion. Lords attempted to legislate wages downward, but enforcement proved increasingly costly and ineffective. This shift didn't create growth, it rearranged who captured surpluses and how flexible the labor system became. Crucially, the effect was not uniform across Europe. Eastern Europe moved in the opposite direction, with the second serfdom tying sorry, with the second serfdom tying peasants more tightly to land. Southern Europe saw stagnation and decline, the most plague trajectory and that later mattered for economic history was concentrated in a narrow North Sea corridor. When people say Europe surged, they often collapse this regional divergence into a continental myth. In reality, most of the European continent remained poor by modern standards. Even the leading regions didn't enjoy spectacular per capita income by contemporary measures. The significance of these regions lie not in how rich they became before 1700, but how their economic environment evolved. The Indian subcontinent followed a different equilibrium path. Pre-modern India was not stagnant, backward, or technologically inerrant. In one of the world's largest producers of textiles, it was one of the world's largest producers of textiles, steel, agricultural goods, artisanal manufacturers. Its total output and share of world productive production remained extraordinarily well into the early modern period. However, like most pre-industrial societies, India operated within a broadly Malthusian framework, where increases in productivity tended over time to translate into population growth rather than permanently higher income per person. Land constraints, climatic variability, and demographic expansion absorbed the surplus. Wealth existed, but it was spread across a very large population and was often captured by elites rather than converted into capital intensive transformation. The idea that India didn't face shocks comparable to plague is also misleading. While the Black Death is unusually well documented in Europe, the subcontinent experienced repeated famines, epidemics, and mortality crises over centuries. The difference is not the absence of calamity, but the nature of the response and the surrounding institutional context. In much of India, political fragmentation, revenue systems tied to land extraction, and limited urban fiscal autonomy meant that shocks didn't generate sustained changes in labor bargaining power or production incentives. Population recovered, surplus was reabsorbed, and the economy returned to a low per capita equilibrium. Stability in that sense became a constraint. Between 15 and 1800s, Europe's gradual advance was driven less by recovery from plague and more by cumulative institutional and commercial changes. States in part of Europe developed increasingly effective systems of taxation, public debt, and contract enforcement became more effective. These were not democratic or benevolent innovations. They were mechanisms for financing war, navies, and administration. However, they had economic side effects. Reliable state borrowing lowered the cost of capital, financial markets deepened, and merchants gained confidence that property and contracts would be protected. Over time, this created a setting in which investment and experimentation became more feasible. The expansion of Atlantic trade after 1500s added another layer. Access to the Americas provided European economies with land-intensive resources, new markets, enormous inflows of silver that monetized trade on a global scale. This did not instantly make Europe rich, but it increased returns to commerce, shipping, and finance. It also allowed European states and firms to externalize resource constraints in ways that land-bound agrarian empires could not. The Indian Ocean world remained commercially vibrant, but it did not generate the same fiscal military feedback loops that emerged in the Atlantic Europe. Agriculture also mattered. In England, agricultural productivity improved gradually through changes in crop rotation, animal husbandry, and land use. This didn't produce immediate prosperity, but it reduced the share of labor needed to feed the population and supported urbanization. More people could work in crafts, services, and eventually manufacturing. This reallocation of labor was a precondition for later industrialization, not its results. What ultimately distinguishes Europe's path is that by 18th century parts of it combined relatively high wages with accessible energy resources, particularly coal. In such an environment, labor-saving technologies became economically rational. Mechanization was not invented because Europeans were smarter, but the price structure made it profitable. In lower-wage economies, including much of Asia, similar technologies didn't offer the same returns and therefore spread more slowly. This is why the decisive divergence in per capita income accelerates after the late 18th century rather than immediately after the plague. From this perspective, the comparison between a plague-stricken Europe and a resilient Indian civilization misses the core issue. Europe didn't leap ahead because it suffered more or recovered faster. It edged forward because a sequence of shocks, institutions, and ecological conditions aligned in a small region over several centuries, gradually breaking out of the Malthusian trap. India's long continuity, demographic resilience, and agrarian strength were sources of stability, but they also meant that productive gains were repeatedly absorbed by population growth rather than translated into substantial per capita increase. The dramatic global inequality we associate with modern history is therefore not a medieval outcome. It is the product of late 18th and 19th century transformations that combined energy, mechanization, finance, and imperial power. Before that point, Europe's advantage was real but limited, regional rather than civilizational, contingent rather than inevitable. Understanding this distinction is essential because it prevents us from mistaking endurance for stagnation, catastrophe for progress, or historical contingency for destiny.